Welcome to Council Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Welcome back to Council Culture, the Business of Law podcast. This week, Ben is joining me. Hello, Ben. It's been a while.
Hey, Meg. How's it going?
Yeah, all good, all good. It's been a kind of busy start of the year, I think, for everyone.
And for you, because you now are a proud homeowner, aren't you?
Yes, I am. And I'm discovering that it's a task. So it's been busy. And let's start off with kind of the biggest news of the week that really kind of, I guess, took over the news agenda everywhere worldwide. Trump's inauguration was on Monday, so for his second term. Obviously, it's caused a lot of stir for the last few weeks and this week as well. He's already passed a bunch of executive orders, I think over 100 now, in his first few days. Let's dig in. There's a lot to cover here. What do you want to start with?
I think you're right. There is a lot to cover here, and it's going to be a slightly different podcast today, isn't it? So rather than go through, legal press, legal industry stories like we normally do, we're probably just going to focus on the intersection between politics, big law, and business. I think an important caveat is, we are apolitical as Byfield, so this isn't a party political broadcast, either pro-Trump or against him. And being honest, I don't think anyone's interested in our personal political opinions, but I think what they will be interested in, our listeners, is how you navigate the fact that the regulatory, cultural, enforcement and business regimes in the US and the UK and definitely the EU are going to become very different over time. And there's a juxtaposition between that and the fact that obviously US firms are penetrating massively in London and to a greater extent in Paris and Milan as well. So I think it's absolutely right that we focus on that, but in the way that's non-partisan.
Yeah, so some of the executive orders that have been passed, I think, will keep a lot of lawyers busy in the US in particular. Starting with there's a lot around DNI. So he's passed a few orders to kind of revoke previous laws around protections for protected characteristics. So I'm guessing this is gonna trigger a lot for a lot of companies across the US in terms of I guess suspending some of their staff or even changing the way of working internally, and I guess a lot of litigation as well. Definitely.
Well, there's two levels, aren't there, for law firms? It's advising clients, as you've correctly said, but also themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you look at the way that firms go to market, and a lot of the agenda for law firm management over the last 20 years has been very, very DEI focused, ESG, etc. And how are they going to approach that? And in many respects, winning business has been, DEI has been central to that. So, having diverse pitch teams, some of the questionnaires you get from corporates, absolutely from the public sector, there's a lot of really, really very sort of hardcore DEI questions that people need to answer. And is that going to have to be rethought now? They're very, very out of line for where the US is. So if you are particularly a big US firm, and you are, you're strong in London and you're having to kind of play ball with the DEI environment we have here, how are you going to balance that, let alone, advise your clients? I think that's a really big challenge. It's a really big challenge for comms people and leadership alike. And I think that's going to be near the top of the agenda for this year. They need to start thinking about that. And there's a whole heap of other things as well. We talked when we were preparing for the podcast around big tech.
Yeah.
And, the fact that the regulatory environment around big tech is feeling very different here from an enforcement perspective than it is in the States. And you said yourself, you only have to look at the cast of characters that were in the inauguration. I mean, they were all there, weren't they?
Yeah.
And they actually had better spots than some of the politicians.
Yeah.
And, if you want a visceral example of how close big tech is to government, you only have to look. And it's very, very different here. And if you are, big firms and you're advising the likes of Meta or Apple,
Amazon, and
how are you gonna navigate that from a go to market perspective? These are big questions, aren't they?
for sure. And I think on the transactional side, it's very clear already from this week that the US is focused on investing in big tech. So I think there's that side of things, but then equally, as you said, the regulatory landscape will change, and also I think just reputationally, we've seen in recent years a lot of for law firms, a lot of protests around ESG and whatnot, and advising oil and gas firms and whatnot. And I wonder if actually the mood is going to shift around big tech as well. And I wonder if it's worth firms keeping an eye on kind of the public mood around advisors to those big tech firms. And, I'll give you an example. Amazon yesterday just completely suppressed its policies protecting LGBT and Black staff in the US. I can't imagine that going down very well for a lot of people in the US. So, it does, I think, put advisors, whatever they may be, to these companies in also reputationally difficult position as well. So it's interesting to see that. I would definitely keep an eye on these developments, because it will have an impact on the way the public reacts. And that in turn will have an impact on what you actually disclose to the public as a firm in terms of the deals that you're advising on or the litigation you're advising on, and just protecting your own staff from potential protests and things like that. Usually they're quite peaceful, but you never know, right? Especially in the US, where people own guns. So.
Right. And one of the big themes for us at Byfield last year was advising clients on decision-making processes around who they act for and who they don't.
Yeah.
And how you shape a client base to match your values. In fact, I spoke at a big IBA conference in London on just that very topic towards the end of the last year, on quite a good panel session in November. But that really was exclusively about oil and gas companies.
Yeah.
And to extend your point, that might move, to big tech.
Yeah.
Ethical questions. And, for all our listeners in the mid-tier, that applies to you as well. It's not just the big US firms who are doing the ranch litigation for Meta, whoever. Those big tech companies give a lot of their IP work and then more day-to-day stuff, don't they? Or licensing to mid-tier firms. And are you going to get pressure from your stakeholders around whether it's right to act for those companies or not? If you look at Apple, for example, the amount of legal work they have around iPhones, all the component parts and the apps and all that sort of stuff. There's a load of firms that work for Apple, not just the big ticket, huge, US firms that do their big ticket stuff. It's the day to day, and they give all that work and all that licensing work out. And I think if you're a mid-tier firm, you need to start thinking about this.
Yeah.
And your staff particularly may start having, issues with some of those big tech companies, and how are you going to address that? Your other clients as well. I mean, it probably helps, doesn't it, that every single person has a device, right? So no one's going to no individual is going to be boycotting big tech. I would have thought, unless you were an incredibly stubborn individual. But it's a valid point, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think anything that happens in the US in the business side, and the regulatory side, whatever the sector and industry, I think, will have a major impact on the markets in Europe and the UK, and the response to that. If you just take tariffs, for example, right now it's just Mexico and Canada, but he might extend that to other countries. That's definitely going to have an impact on kind of deal making here. How you regulate, depending on what the US does around AI, for example, that will definitely have at least some kind of influence over what people do here, what the regulators choose to do. So I think it's going to be an interesting 4 years ahead, for sure. And it's hard to plan for, I think, just because of how unpredictable this all is. It seems at least that deal makers are positive about their own markets. We were reading a story from Law.com around P. It seems the mood has shifted from 2 years ago already. There's been more deals. We've seen this, more deals, and they expect that to continue. And they expect kind of, PE funds have got money to burn right now. So I think especially in the infrastructure area in Europe. So I think that's going to continue. And I don't think this administration in the US will want to stifle business in any kind of way. So I think they'll do anything to make sure that transactions keep going, which is positive news, I guess. So it should be interesting.
I think the regulatory environment could become quite challenging.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the lawyers' forward-looking report, in terms of their predicted trends for this year, and I pretty much agreed with all of them. And one of them was around, the difference in enforcement regimes on both sides of the pond, and that being a challenge for US firms and the real distance that it will cause. And I think the same with regulation as well. Without getting too nerdy from the private equity perspective, there's always been attempts to regulate US funds doing stuff in Europe. You had the AIFM directive, talk about passports and all that stuff. So it's not a new thing. Law.com look at private equity quite frequently, don't they? We know that Paul has a background in PE and knows his stuff. And I thought that piece was good that you're referring to some really good market commentators in there. I can't see anything stifling what private equity may or may not do. They know how to navigate these things.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of enforcement and regulation, it's, as you say, it's going to be interesting actually, because in the US, in one way, I would expect enforcement from the DOJ and all that to be a lot more now targeted against some political opponents, if we can say that in quotation marks. It's interesting. There was a story in the Times this morning just alluding to the fact that Trump was saying he'd be keen to pursue Biden for alleged crimes, which is interesting. I mean, he's made it clear that he will he's made it clear throughout this campaign that he would try to go after some Democrats and whatnot. So let's see if that actually happens. So I think it will, on the white collar side, I think it will remain busy, but I wonder what kind of cases they'll have forward, because I think anything that has to do with business will actually not necessarily take place the same way.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I think it should be interesting. I wonder how that relationship between those authorities in the US and the EU and the UK, if they'll collaborate just as well as they have in recent years, or if it's going to be impacted in some way.
Well, if you are a global investigations partner, one of your go-to-market points is always that you understand the nuance of the relationships between the SFO, the DOJ, and the equivalents in other countries. If they're becoming less aligned, one of your challenges is to keep up to speed with how those relationships will develop and grow.
Yeah.
And actually, if you are a really good investigations partner, I would have thought that the more that the SFO and the DOJ are not aligned, or there is some beef between the US government and the DOJ, et cetera, the more you understand that, the more value that you're at this year. And it's a good point. Maybe it's something that Gus and Dina will want to look at in the litigation podcast, but how global investigations may be impacted by the slight disconnect between the cultural and political approaches on both sides of the Atlantic. It's probably a topic in and of itself, isn't it?
Definitely. I think, I'll be definitely keeping an eye on this, because it is going to develop, and I think really quickly, and I think we'll see a very instant shift when he starts going after people. I think we'll see exactly what they're going to be investigating, and the types of cases they'll take on is going to be interesting for sure.
Things which shocked me this week, and I am going to put aside just for 30 seconds the apolitical point I made at the beginning of the broadcast. I don't know if I'm now being apolitical or not, but I can't get my head around someone who's pardoning stuff. How do you pardon somebody for something they haven't done yet? We are very prim and proper here in the UK, aren't we, with the rule of law being sacrosanct, and it's completely alien to me how people can be absolved of things they haven't done yet. Yeah. And it's quite amusing to see people actually not wanting to be pardoned because they they feel that they haven't done anything or will, and it is very Old Testament, isn't it? This whole retribution thing, and playing out at a political level. For me, it seems like something out of the feudal system or the medieval ages. But there you go.
It's just really interesting when you think about, the UK, the rule of law is supreme and all this stuff, and in other countries, you don't have that sense of rule of law, but there is kind of a standard and boundaries. And just even in France, for example, we don't hesitate to go after political leaders for types of corruption and embezzlement and whatever else, right?
So you don't chop their heads off anymore.
No, we don't anymore.
Yeah.
That's one thing that we don't do anymore, but we do go after them for like prison sentences and whatnot. I mean, at the moment we've got one case going on, so it's interesting to see that. And we've seen South Korea's got the same thing going on at the moment with their own president. Like, it's interesting to see the very, very difference between this side of the pond and where, there are standards, and it doesn't matter who you are not above the law. But
the difference is, this is slightly off point, but it's from a reputation management perspective. A lot of our listeners are PR professionals. Rehabilitation of reputation is much harder in this country than it is in the US and other. Look at Sarkozy and others. Once your reputation is gone in this environment, I don't know if it's to do with the rule of law or not. It's really, really hard to get it back.
Yeah,
I think in the US it's much easier.
Oh,
right?
I think it is. Yeah.
So it's different.
I think it definitely is. Although, to be fair, I feel like that's shifting in the UK. I think it's not. I think it's different with social media. I think now you can easily get your reputation back, or have still a following of people who believe in you and will support you very vocally. So I think it's fascinating. But moving on to regulation in the UK. So the head of the CMA is no longer head of the CMA. And it's interesting because obviously the government has been saying since July that they want to kind of attract more investment into the UK and business. And one of the ways of doing that is making sure that, these authorities and the regulators are a bit more lax, I guess. And I mean, that's quite a radical thing to do, to get rid of the head of the CMA. And it's funny, there was a comment in the FT full disclosure this morning from a partner saying that, it would be a good time to file for a merger now that there's nobody. So I wonder if that's actually going to trigger some activity.
I'm not a competition law expert, I'm not a competition lawyer, but I think the CMA gets a rough time from what I can see.
Yeah.
They're almost always damned if they do and damned if they don't. Every decision they make is, praised or not praised. It seems a bit of a rough gig, much more than the takeover panel, which is sort of an equivalent if you're a transactional lawyer, right? If you're seconded there, it seems like a slightly more straightforward gig than it is at the CMA, when you're kind of doing similar things as making rulings on things that corporates want to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if they're going to replace them, or like what the next regime will be. I'm guessing there's going to be a review of some of the roles, and there's a lot of movement. Let's just say that it's clear that the government is trying to make things happen for business to continue and to be good in the UK. I don't know if they're going about it the right way.
I don't know either. I don't know, but it just seems to me as if they get just a little bit of a rough time politically. The CMA. We saw that with the Microsoft Activision thing last year, when there was all sorts of pressure, and that was only the stuff that you read about in the papers. Behind the scenes, my goodness, there must have been a lot of manoeuvring.
There must have been, for sure. So it's fascinating. So yeah, I think it's kind of like the main themes we wanted to discuss today. Ben, was there any kind of other stories that you wanted to flag? Yeah,
the one I'm looking at is everything that's going on with Rosenblatt.
Yeah,
I think that has got so many interesting points. It's quite Shakespearean, isn't it? Right? The eponymous, which is a word I often struggle to say. Ian Rosenblatt going after his former firm or combination of firms, and the disconnects between the management between him and them, but also the backdrop of funding as well, and looking at there aren't too many success stories of financial investment or floats or whatever with law firms going well, are there?
That's true. Although to be fair, some of them have gone quite well, but I think it's just it's a risk, right? Like it's a total gamble. So,
and I just always think that the culture of partnerships and law firms and the idiosyncrasies thereof don't necessarily lend themselves in a straightforward sense to an investment. And I'll be following that quite closely. I'm sort of reminded of Superdry, which were a client when I was at Saltrame and was sort of a little bit involved, looking at Julian Dunkerton, who was obviously the founder of Superdry, founded it on a market stall, didn't he, in Cheltenham, left the company, tried to come back, saw where it was going wrong and wanted to take over it again and sort it all out. And there's quite a lot of similarities with this story, aren't there? So I'll be following it quite closely. You know, sometimes there's a story that you focus on.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are big stories where you don't.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff around Axiom Ints, I know Michael was really, really across that in the last few years, and I kind of wasn't. But this one I am. I think it's not just because one of my neighbours is a partner at one of them. I'm not going to say which one, but one of the firms that make up Rosenblatt. So I've always had a slight interest in what goes on there. But I'll be watching that this year. I think it'll be interesting and quite a nice juxtaposition between some of the big political, economic, and regulatory themes that we've looked at today.
For sure, and I think that the Rosenblatt story, I mean, I think it will rumble on. The question is, in what way? Because obviously, the last story was that he was claiming that the board had made defamatory allegations against him. So I wonder if actually that's going to be a case in court, or if it was just a statement to be out there, because it is hard to sue for defamation. So I'd be really keen to know what happens next. And yeah, we'll be watching that really closely. It should be interesting at the very least. And I think it just tells you a lot about kind of, like board relationships within law firms, especially the listed ones, and kind of management breakdowns. And I think this is particularly difficult because they're listed, and some of that will be quite public, as it wouldn't be in a kind of normal LLP that's not listed. So it's very, very interesting. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on that. On that note, I think that's about it. Do you want to add anything else, Ben?
No, I think we've covered a lot today. So I think I'm done. Yeah.
Yeah, and to the listeners, we'll be back next week for another episode. We are on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and yeah, we'll see you next week.
You've been listening to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.